Kenny here today with Gardening Simplified. Today I'm going to talk about hand pollinating your crops. Many of you might be wondering why you should have to hand pollinate your crops. You see bees in your garden and you think that everything's fine and everything's taken care of. But sometimes that isn't necessarily the case. I noticed that in my garden as I had been watching it over the months here. Now, I always took the extra effort whenever I was out in my tomatoes, which many of you know that if you take on your tomato plants and you just tap the flowers, or if you just kind of rub on them once they're opened up, and the best time to do this is early afternoon, sometime around between noon and 2 o'clock is a real good time. Reason for that is that's usually when the pollen's the heaviest. Now you can, some people take an electric toothbrush and they vibrate and stuff like that. I just go around and I'll tap the flowers. Sometimes I'll actually rub the ends of them and pollinate them. Now, if you're wanting to save seeds, say if you got an heirloom or something like that, and you want to save the seeds for next year, you have to be careful if you're using more than one type of, or if you've got more than one type of tomato plant in your garden, because like this tomato plant here is different than those tomato plants over there, and it's different from these tomato plants over here. So if you say you go rubbing on all the flowers over on one of those tomato plants over there, and then you come over here and you start rubbing on the flowers on this tomato plant, well, the chances are you're going to take pollen from that plant and you're going to put some onto this one. So your seed wouldn't be true to this plant. So if you're planning to save seeds, and normally what I do is I take a bloom bag and put over my flowers if I'm going to save seeds. And as you can see here, this particular branch is marked. There's a string tied around here, so I know that these tomatoes here were pollinated, self-pollinated, so they weren't pollinated by a bee or from pollen from another plant. So these seeds will be the same. Now, I'm not sure if this is my unknown, so I'm saving seeds for it to see, but these seeds would be whatever it produced, not a cross between one of these other tomatoes. And that's the way that you would do it. You put a bloom bag on it and you're for sure what you have. But we're going to talk about hand pollinating because you know I was talking about, you say you have bees in your garden, you see them in your garden. Well, I had bees, I could see them all around here on flowers. I could see them over on my onion blooms. They were just covered. They were covered with bees. I'd see on some of the little yellow clover flowers around the yard, they were just covered. You could just hear them humming. But I've spent a lot of time on my tomatoes, whether it's checking for problems, trimming off lower limbs that might have an issue or that are too close to the ground. And I just naturally come through and I tap my flowers while I'm doing this. Well, what happens is I end up with a crop of tomatoes that is just real nice. But I've actually given some of these away, and I talk to the other people and I say, how's your tomato plants doing? And they say, well, I'm just starting to get a tomato. And they're the same size as my plants. They're the same type of my plants. I don't have a plant one here like I'd given away that doesn't have a bunch of tomatoes on it. I mean, they're just loaded down with tomatoes. But the reason for this is I've been taking, every time I come out here, I'll fondle the flowers or tap the flowers and take and make sure that they're getting pollinated and that they're going to set fruit. And that's because bees haven't, for some reason, they haven't, either they've got a good enough source somewhere else, for their nectar and pollen that they're collecting, but for some reason they're not interested in the tomato plants. Now I have planted some flowers in here just recently, and that might help with a lot of them. You know, plant some basil or something and let it go ahead and flower out and stuff, and that would bring them in. But don't count on that's a given. Now some of these I haven't been out here regular. You can see this one here is turning yellow and it's going to fall off. This flower was not pollinated, and anytime they're not pollinated, they're going to fall off. Now this one here acts like it is pollinated. I'll come by and I'll pop the blooms out of them, but there's a little tomato off in the end of that because it was pollinated. I don't come out here, it's every day now, and I need to because I have some vines that definitely need to be tied up. But when you have 110 tomato plants and you've got a whole lot of other area in the garden that you maybe need to weed and different things like that, or other projects, it takes a lot of your time. But we're gonna say that's the easiest fix on tomatoes, and a lot of you know that, some don't. But don't suppose bees are going to do it. It's the same thing with my jalapeno peppers here. Now these plants are loaded with jalapeno peppers. I haven't seen a bee one on them, but I come by here and I just shake them, tap the flowers. Some of them I miss and they'll drop off, but most of them I catch enough that like I say, I'm really loaded. And now a lot of people stake their plants. Mine seem to be, and they were last year, they got it pretty tall as far as height wise, probably 3 times as high as they are now, and they never needed stake. Not to say that you shouldn't stake, but like I say, it depends on your plant and how healthy it is. If you're putting a whole lot of nitrogen to it, too much nitrogen, you're going to have a spindly plant because it's going to try to grow green and leafy stuff, and so your stems are going to be spindly. If you have a problem that your plant isn't supporting itself, then the problem is most likely that it's not getting the nutrients it needs, or too many of some that it shouldn't get. But peppers are the same way. Like I say, they just tap them and that takes care of them. All tomatoes, whether it be cherry tomatoes or what, just take and tap them. Now, it's different when you're down here and you're dealing with cucumbers. Now, I've had a whole lot of cucumbers set female flowers. That one might have been pollinated, I don't know. But the only way that you can be sure if you don't see bees is pollinate it yourself. And it's a simple enough thing to do. Which people use different methods, but you look at this flower here and you see it has just a little stem and then you have a flower on it. This is a male flower. Now some people pull off these male flowers and they'll take and they'll fold them back and they rub them inside the female flower, which would be this one. Now I'm going to hope that this one has actually pollinated it. The flower came off good, so maybe it did. But what you would do is you would find a female flower, and we're going to have to look around here because when you want to find one that's open, sometimes it's hard, and it could be really difficult. There are a lot of male flowers, but all the female flowers, here's another one, and it seems to that was pollinated there. The flower come off. A lot of times when they're not pollinated, the flower doesn't even separate from it, and you'll always see the fruit start turning colors. But the bees, I did see I have a friendly bumblebee that comes through, a smaller one that likes these. In fact, I got a bee in here right now, which is a bumblebee. You can see him down there working it. And these are getting pollinated because I actually have bees in here. But earlier in the season, I didn't have anything. But once they start blooming like mad, okay, here is a female flower. Now what you would do is, whoops, I just pushed and knocked it off. But you would just rub that in there, or the easiest method for not destroying your plant is you'd take a brush and you'd come in here on the male flower and you'd just brush around it. And then you would take and you'd find a female flower. And this one is probably already pollinated. The flower's starting to dry up. But you would just brush it. You would just brush it around inside of that flower. And that would pollinate it. The same method is used if you want to hand pollinate and you want to cross one particular vegetable variety with another one. You would take and the reason why I say that is we have the same thing here. The important thing is to know that your female flower always has fruit on it and your male flower always has a single stem. But if you was going to cross two types, you would take the pollen from this plant and say go to another plant and cross it up, and that's when you get your hybrids or your F1s. Is they're crossed that way. Now sometimes you naturally get a cross in your garden. Now you might not think about it, but I have watermelons, and one year I had some butternut squash on the row next to them. Well, I saved some seeds from a watermelon and I planted it, and I've saved seeds from this variety before. Or no, I didn't actually plant them. They come up volunteer. So, but I had actually saved seeds from that variety. Well, what happened was that butternut squash, the bees had pollinated it and had pollinated that watermelon. Well, this watermelon was not sweet at all. It didn't have watermelon flavor at all. Very, very light. So when you're saving seeds, and if you're going to pollinate it to save seeds, take and make sure you put a bloom bag on that flower before it opens. That way you can take the bag off, you can pollinate it, and then you can put the bag back on and then mark it so you can save that seed. Now, I hope this helps. I hope that it's really helpful to get your tomato crop increased, because like I say, I've had some people this year that's actually asked me what would be the problem with their tomatoes. They say it's 6-7 foot tall, but it hadn't put on any tomatoes on it yet. It's been blooming like crazy. And she says, I see bees. And I have to tell them, I said, it's just like me. I see bees in my garden, but that doesn't mean that the bees are working the plants. Unless you actually see them on your tomato plants and you're having a problem with crop set, or your pepper plants, you're having a problem with crop set, then take and shake your plant. It doesn't take much. And then once you shake it, once it starts going, because a lot of these won't make. I don't come out here regular. I don't do these regular. And of course it has fruit set on there. But it would have a whole lot more fruit set if I would start taking and making sure these flowers were pollinated. Some of these, just like this one, I don't know if a bee could get into it being where it's at. Well, that's because it fell off somewhere else. Okay. But anyway, If you think this would help someone else, please share it. Hit the like button. That way YouTube will bump it up there to the top. And if you want to see more of these, subscribe and hit the bell button so you'll be notified. Happy gardening.